So this is our October meeting of New Mexicans for Science and Reason. I'm Dave Thomas and the president of NMSR. And I think we have our hardworking vice president here, if that is who's at the other end of John's iPad. Could be John Covan. Okay. So I'm going to whoa, we're still letting folks in. Make co-host. Here we go. All righty. So happy to introduce tonight's speaker, who is Robert Bartholomew. He will be speaking on the myth of Havana Syndrome, and he's joining us all the way from New Zealand via the miracle of electronics. And Robert is an American-born medical sociologist, a writer, journalist, and a human rights advocate who is well known for his books on social panics and outbreaks of mass hysteria throughout history. And he's looked at cases from demonically possessed nuns in the Middle Ages to the Salem witch hunts of 1692, all the way to contemporary episodes like the twitching schoolgirls of Leroy, New York, and the students at a Massachusetts school who hiccuped for a year. So he's going to be discussing how bad science, bad journalism, and bad government created the myth of Havana Syndrome. And there you have it. And Robert is also a fellow of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so we're ready to and eager to hear all about Havana Syndrome and what you've dug up.
Yeah. Well, look, the first thing I thought when I heard of Havana Syndrome, which was when everybody heard of it, wasn't called Havana Syndrome at the time. That would have been in August of 2017, when the State Department admitted that there was something really unusual going on in Cuba. And the theory was that it was some kind of sonic attack. Microwaves weren't even in the picture until 2018. And so I just assumed that it was true. I assumed, based on what I had heard from the government, that these diplomats over at the Cuban embassy had been attacked by some type of sonic weapon. And then I started to do more research. And I think I published the first mainstream journal article on this back in 2017 in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine. And I have to say, I think that article has aged well, because I think what was published there is spot on with what happened and what we now know with the facts in the case. And whenever you look at mass psychogenic illness, so-called mass hysteria, mass psychogenic illness, you have to look at the context, because the context is key. And so what was the context here? It was back in November of 2016, you had some CIA agents living in a posh neighborhood of Havana who were walking outside their homes at night, and they heard these strange sounds. And one of them said, you know, it's almost like somebody is pointing a beam of sound at my home. And they didn't think too much of it. And then you got to late December of 2016, and one of them had ear pain, a headache, and some hearing loss in one ear. And he went to the embassy clinic in the American Embassy in Havana, and he mentioned those symptoms. And that's pretty typical of people that you would find all around the world going into doctors' offices reporting symptoms like that. And then he noted something unusual. He said, you know, since I've been having this, it's like somebody is pointing a beam of sound at my home at night. And when a couple of other CIA officers from the same unit in Havana had mentioned those sounds being pointed at their homes, they developed this folk theory that the Cubans were using some type of sonic weapon to harass the American agents. And at first you think, well, why would you think something so far-fetched? Well, it's because the Americans under Obama opened the American embassy in 2015. But long before, when Americans had been posted over there in the past, there was a long history of Cuban agents harassing American diplomats over there. So when the American diplomats opened the embassy in 2015, they were told in no uncertain terms by the State Department, you will be surveilled 24/7. Even while you're asleep in your home, there'll be somebody watching your house. And of the long history that's part of CIA folklore, when American agents, diplomats were in Havana in the past, they would follow you around, you'd park your car, and then you'd go somewhere and come back, and somebody would have parked their car within like an inch of your car, so now you can't get out. You'd wake up in the morning and there would be cigarette butts on your kitchen table, and you don't smoke. There would be dog poo on your kitchen floor, and you don't have a pet. Books would be rearranged in your bookshelf. Windows would be open and mosquitoes would be flowing in. It was a fairly low-level harassment, but it was very well known, and all of the diplomats over there and the CIA officers were well versed on that because they were told. And so that's the backdrop to what happened. So because of that historical situation, this folk theory emerged that the Americans were being harassed by a sonic weapon. And so that was the first explanation that the State Department doctors came up with as the most likely explanation for this. But for me, it all comes down to this. You can summarize this case in one sentence. When you hear the sound of hoofbeats in the night, first think horses, not zebras. The doctors at the American State Department went for the most exotic hypothesis right from the start. They were going not for horses or zebras, they were going for unicorns, when they should have stuck to more mundane explanations. And in a nutshell, that's what happened. And there's this thing in science where people will come up with an explanation, they'll publish an article about it, and then even though it looks like they're wrong, they'll defend it to the death, right? Because they're afraid of the embarrassment. And I think part of it comes down to the Trump administration and not wanting to be embarrassed. And to make a long story short, later on, of the first 21 people who had their stories collected and were looked at, those first 21 people that supposedly had Havana Syndrome, 8 of them recorded their so-called attacks. Because after these started, State Department officials said if you could record the attacks, that would be great. They did. And there was a study, the Jason study group for the US government looked at these recordings, and they concluded that they were the mating call of the Indies short-tailed cricket, one of the loudest crickets in the world. So anyway, these recordings, people have said, well, you know, how can you come up with this? And look, it couldn't be the current explanation of microwaves, because you can't make an audio recording of microwaves, right? And so, and all sorts of other things would be at play there. If it was microwaves, you'd have the Wi-Fi shutting down, you'd have computers shutting down, you'd have all sorts of other signatures there that you don't see here. And so the most mundane explanation appears to be the best. Then you've got all these reports that came out. I mean, there's so many reports, I got a list of them here somewhere, where, I mean, it's just, you've got the around 2018, the Jason report came out with their study, these scientists who said it's very unlikely it's microwaves or sonic weapons. They pointed to more mundane explanations as being likely. The FBI report came out around that time, but it was kept under wraps. It's been leaked, and they concluded, as we did in our book, that it was mass psychogenic illness. The CDC came out with a report. They said they're not sure. You have the National Academy of Sciences then in December of 2020 come out with a report saying it's most likely pulse microwave radiation. You can see why the public would be confused here. And then earlier this year in January, the main CIA study of this, they came out and they said of over 1,000 cases now globally, their conclusion was there was no evidence of a foreign actor. And most of these cases are people simply redefining a variety of mundane symptoms under a new heading, Havana Syndrome. And that anxiety also played a key role. Anxiety, a kind of a code word there for mass psychogenic illness. And then more recently, around February of this year, you had a small advisory group for the CIA, outsourced, come up and say pulse microwave radiation again. So it's very confusing for the public. But here's all you need to know. The main studies here by the very competent groups that have access to all these documents in the government was the Jason panel, 2018, the FBI around that same time, and the main CIA. They have similar conclusions. But you've got this unusual situation where you've got the National Academy of Sciences coming out and saying the most likely explanation is pulse microwave radiation, along with that small advisory panel to the CIA, the external panel. What do those two groups have in common? David Relman, who is a microbiologist at Stanford University, was the head of both panels, the National Academy of Sciences panel and that small advisory panel to the CIA, made the same conclusion that it was pulse microwave radiation. No, none of the other studies, none of the other panels have. Now, here's the thing about the Relman panel. David Relman appears to be a very competent microbiologist, but when it comes to statements he's making about things like the microwave, so-called microwave attacks, they are clearly incorrect. And here's what's interesting about the NAS panel, National Academy of Sciences panel. My friend, who I've published 4 articles with, Simon Wesley at King's College London, he is one of the world's foremost authorities on mass psychogenic illness. He was on the panel. And then he gave an interview to a radio station in which he said, this is before they come out with a report, that based on what I've seen, that mass psychogenic illness is a real possibility here. They kicked him off the panel. So he's no longer on the panel. And when you look at who they interviewed for the panel, it was almost all believers and outliers and non-mainstream scientists. There were a lot of non-mainstream scientists who were interviewed on that panel. Now, that panel issued its findings in December of 2020. Our book, with the book I wrote with neurologist Bob Ballo at UCLA, that book came out in in May of 2020. And in the National Academy of Sciences report, they said that they couldn't exclude mass psychogenic illness as a possibility. However, there was zero epidemiological evidence on that, so they couldn't really assess it. But that's not true. If they had looked at our book, which came out 6 months earlier, the only book on the topic, why wouldn't you look at it? And we came out and we clearly showed the early epidemiological spread from the small unit of CIA officers to the American embassy and then to the Canadian embassy, and then later it went globally. And I listened to David Relman speak, and he was saying when their panel was operating, most of the time they were operating, it was under COVID restrictions, and it was done through Zoom. And they didn't have access to a lot of the documents that the main CIA had, that the FBI had, that the Jason report had. And a lot of it was through open source publications. And it just doesn't make any sense. And if anybody out there interviews David Relman, here's my question for you. How come in your main report from the National Academy of Sciences, you mentioned me as an expert on mass psychogenic illness, I think 7 times, something like that. And you mentioned my research, but you ignored the book that had come out 6 months earlier. Why did that happen? And why did you kick Simon Wesley off the panel just for giving an assessment to a media outlet, an assessment that didn't jive with what you eventually supposedly concluded? So who are you going to believe here? The main CIA, the FBI and all of their resources, and the Jason group that had all of their resources, or the National Academy of Sciences? And look, when you say National Academy of Sciences, it has like all this weight behind it, but does it really? Because those groups have their own natural mechanisms in terms of coming to conclusions. I mean, they were very slippery in their conclusions. They didn't rule out mass psychogenic illness. They just said there wasn't enough evidence to make an assessment. But that's not true. And then, you know, he doubled down when they had that February of 2022 advisory panel, came out again and said pulse microwave radiation. Well, that's not what the CIA has concluded. That's not what the FBI has concluded. That's not what the Jason panel has concluded. And so I would suggest to statistical experts out there that David Relman is the outlier. So look, I can continue on and I can go on for the next hour. But if you want to ask any questions pop up, that's fine as well. I mean, the other issue here that's a big player is other scientists. You've got, and this played a major part in this, the Journal of the American Medical Association, very well-respected journal. However, they have people on their editorial board and who are editors there who are human beings, and human beings make mistakes. So you had in 2018, they came out with a study and they looked at a group of patients from the American Embassy, and they used as a threshold of impairment for that study for having Havana syndrome symptoms at 40%. That is unheard of. According to Sergio Della Sella, University of Edinburgh, the editor of the journal Cortex, it should have been closer to 5%. And I mean, the statements that some of those people were making after they published that study on the JAMA network, the main scientist there, Douglas Smith, I believe his name was, he was saying things like, well, it couldn't be mass psychogenic illness because there was no evidence that the patients were colluding their symptoms together. I mean, that's not, collusion is not mass psychogenic illness. I mean, we're talking, you know, maybe 100 years ago, but it's just demonstrably wrong. And the other interesting thing is Bob Ballo, who I wrote the book with on Havana syndrome, the neurologist at the UCLA Medical Center, Bob Ballo was the first port of call for the JAMA editors. When they got that study, they first contacted Professor Ballo because he is the expert on the vestibular system, the system that deals with the inner ear, spatial awareness, and balance, and things like this. And they asked him to review the study, and he rejected it. And they published it anyway. And that's when he contacted me and he said, you know, I just can't believe what's going on here. And they published the study, and he said to me, he said, you know, I have reviewed about 1,000 articles throughout my career. Bob's about 80 now, in peer-reviewed journals. And in every single instance, I am given the reviewer's comments who are other reviewers for the article, because you always have other reviewers. That's the way peer review works. And he said, that's only not happened once. And that was with JAMA. They did not show him the other reviewers' comments, assuming there were other reviewers. And that's very odd and unusual. And then you've got the two JAMA studies. That's the first study that came out, very methodologically flawed. And then that study was so flawed that the entire editorial board of the journal Cortex came out and asked for them to clarify what they were claiming with that 40% impairment or retract the study. And then so they came out with a second study in JAMA in 2019. And the problem with that study was they came out and they found brain anomalies. Okay, there were some brain anomalies, but it got reported as brain damage. And 12 of the patients reportedly who had Havana syndrome had histories of concussion compared to 0 in the control group. And that's another major issue and flaw with that study, the 2019 JAMA study. But yes, they found brain anomalies. But they said in that study, the anomalies weren't so significant that they couldn't have been caused by individual variation. The translation, they're not very significant. In those anomalies, it's not unusual to find in small cohorts like this, to find minor anomalies. In fact, it's very common. And those anomalies are the same types of anomalies you'd expect to find in a group under long-term, prolonged stress. Why would that group of diplomats in Cuba have been under long-term, prolonged stress? Well, you've got the head of the embassy there coming out in early 2017 and telling the diplomats there that you may have been the subject of a sonic attack. Don't stand or sleep near windows. Use extreme caution if you hear strange sounds or feel unwell to report them. And so you had them hyper vigilant. On top of that, they had all been counseled that they are going to be surveilled 24/7. There will be surveillance. You will be watched all the time. So you got families over there with children. And so they are under stress, and they were under stress for several months. And yes, when they were having symptoms, and the symptoms, the other issue with Havana syndrome is the symptoms. The symptoms were headache, nausea, forgetfulness, fatigue, difficulty concentrating, disorientation, confusion, balance problems, tinnitus, ear pressure, ear pain. Later, they added nosebleeds and depression. I mean, these are symptoms that are so vague that human beings have been experiencing these in just about any given week of their life since we've been living in caves, right? I mean, they're so vague, and that's another issue with Havana syndrome. And the other thing with the syndrome, so these brain anomalies, which are not that unusual, got reported in the press as brain damage. And that's disturbing to me as a journalist myself. One of the first stations I ever worked at was a CNN affiliate in Albany, New York in the mid-1980s. And CNN, NBC, CBS have reported these claims that there was brain damage in the Cuban cohort. That has absolutely not been demonstrated. There were brain anomalies, and it's not the same thing. So you've got this confusion with the JAMA studies. You've got these claims in the media of brain damage that aren't true. And then you've got the government being influenced by politics. Not only when Trump was in there, but even after Trump was in there, because, I mean, we all know that Trump was not big on apologies or, showing weakness. Okay, so I understand that. Then Biden gets in there, and in September of 2021, you had Pamela Spratlin, the former ambassador to a couple of countries. She had been at the head of the Havana syndrome investigation for the government for about 6 months. And she had a conference call, and she was doing some discussions and taking questions from Havana syndrome patients. And right around the time that that interview took place, the FBI report findings had been leaked to the media. And so someone asked, do you subscribe to the belief that the FBI apparently had from the leaked report conclusions that it was mass psychogenic illness that could be a major influence here? And she said, well, I'm keeping all of my options on the table. Well, within a week, she was forced to resign as the head of the panel because there was such an outcry that people were saying things like, we're not crazy. You know, we don't have a mental illness, but mass psychogenic illness has nothing to do with being crazy. It is not a mental illness per se. And, you know, it's a collective stress response based on a belief. We all have beliefs. Therefore, we are all potential victims. And so, but look, you know there's an issue. And you know that the investigation, even under Biden, is being driven by politics and not science. When someone says, I'm keeping all hypotheses on the table, including mass psychogenic illness, and they are forced to step down just for keeping that possibility open. And that's unfortunate. But it tells you where we are at this stage here. I can keep going on, or I'm happy to take questions here as well.
All right. Anybody have any questions for Robert?
Did Havana syndrome appear anywhere else? That is, claims
Really good question. So in 2017, you had some reports or claims of Havana syndrome in US diplomats in China. And in their infinite wisdom, when this happened, the US government, the State Department, issued an alert a while after that report came out to all of its diplomats and intelligence officers all over the world to be on the lookout for symptoms of Havana syndrome and any strange noises or head pressure that may accompany it. And then about a year ago, the Department of Defense came out and they issued an alert for all, I think it was 2.9 million military personnel and contractors around the world to also be on the lookout for Havana syndrome symptoms, and that it was your patriotic duty to report it. But the problem is those symptoms of dizziness, fatigue, forgetfulness, difficulty concentrating, I mean, are so common and so vague. And so you got now recently when the CIA came out with their interim report in January of 2022, they were saying suddenly it ballooned up to over 1,000 cases. Sure. And I'm sure there's many more out there. And the other issue there was compensation. They were throwing out the possibility of financial compensation because you got lawyers involved here. And so you've really got two things going on here. You've got the initial cohort in Cuba, and they did have some anomalies. They had some symptoms, ambiguous symptoms, but some minor brain anomalies for having been under that stress. And then you've got this spreading around the world. And I think what's happened around the world is more mass suggestion. And it's a redefinition of mundane symptoms that people would have anyways, right? I mean, people do have anomalous symptoms, the State Department's word for it, right? What they describe these things as anomalous symptoms. But so people wake up in the morning and they have a headache and they feel a bit fuzzy and they might hear a sound in the background, and maybe it's a cricket, maybe it's a cicada, who knows? Maybe it's some equipment from a construction site, and suddenly they think, oh, maybe I have Havana syndrome, and also subconsciously or consciously, maybe I can get compensation for this. And so it's really a mess when you throw in the lawyers, when you throw in the possibility of compensation, you've got all this ambiguity. And I really believe that the main CIA and the FBI, I think they figured this out. And that's why they issued that interim report in January of 2022 of this year, saying the vast majority of these cases are explainable through just symptoms that people ordinarily would have, and they're putting it under a new label, Havana Syndrome, and some can be put down to anxiety or psychogenic illness. I think the vast majority of symptoms that have been reported so far aren't mass psychogenic illness. They're simply people redefining symptoms that they're having under a new label. So you've got all this stuff going on. So I think they figured it out. And the issue now is when they came out and made that report, there was a huge hubbub in Congress. How is this possible? You know, how could they come to these conclusions when the National Academy of Sciences came to a different conclusion? And here's the thing for me that's really interesting, and it gets forgotten, and that is, so you got the Jason report coming out around 2018. You got an updated report in late 2021, similar conclusions. So the Jason report comes out. The FBI report, now the Jason report was kept under wraps until September of 2021. So the public didn't know about it, but Congress did. The FBI report came out around the same time. It wasn't made public, although it's been leaked more recently, but people didn't know at the time. But Congress did. And Congress people, senators would have known the FBI concluded it was mass psychogenic illness. Jason report, same thing. And at the same time those reports were available to the Congress people, they kept coming out, a number of them, saying, oh, we think it's sonic weapon, or we think it's microwaves. There's some foreign actor involved here. How disingenuous and dishonest. And now they go on record saying this stuff, and suddenly the CIA, they latch on to the National Academy of Sciences, right? Because they conclude something that's in their favor, that, you know, that's politically expedient for them. And then suddenly the CIA finally has to come out with something. They do in early 2022, and they knock down the National Academy of Sciences report and issue a report that's consistent with the Jason report and the FBI report. And now it's like, what's going on here? We need to get to the bottom of this. Just listen to the science. I mean, who are you going to believe? The outliers headed by David Relman, or your CIA and your FBI, who have a multitude of documents and tools at their disposal.
So that National Academy of Sciences report still stands, no rebuttal from the Academy. Is that correct?
No, and that's concerning because, I mean, they stacked the deck with believers. I mean, they let Michael Hoffer at the University of Miami present. Why didn't they have, who published this article, which couldn't get published in a major journal? And it ended up getting published in a journal that he was on the editorial board of. And as Bob Ballo has said at UCLA, and Bob is the expert on the vestibular system, has written the standard textbook in the field. Some of the studies used and the JAMA studies, some of the tests used in the JAMA studies were created by Bob Ballo. That's why the JAMA editors went to him in the first place. And Bob was saying that if what Michael Hoffer is claiming, that every single one of the people had OLIF damage in their inner ears, it would be one of the biggest discoveries in the history of neurology in the last century. But the data is not there. And you just need the data to go on, and it's not there. So yeah, it's very frustrating because look, if I don't know anything about Havana Syndrome and I see National Academy of Sciences,
yeah,
I'm tending to believe what they are issuing, and they have a lot to answer for. For one, I would like them to tell me why they said there was zero epidemiological evidence when the evidence was there. It was out there. It was in her book, and it was Tim Golden had published that information as well a couple of years earlier. He's won 2 Pulitzer Prizes. He was over in Cuba. He did a lot of interviews. I think he interviewed like 36 people or something. And he looked at a lot of the documents, and he had noted that as well, about the early epidemiological spread from the CIA officers to the US Embassy to the Canadian Embassy. And people say to me, they say, well, what's the mass psychogenic illness part of that? I mean, what's the telltale sign? Well, first of all, mass psychogenic illness tends to go down the age scale and the prestige scale. So you've got CIA officers, then diplomats, and then it spreads. That's one thing. Also, small cohesive unit under stress because they're hearing these sounds, right? And they're starting to exhibit some symptoms, right? There's another one there. And another telltale sign with mass psychogenic illness is you get, well, first, I should say, none of this happened at the American Embassy. It happened at one of 2 large hotels, an apartment complex, and in diplomatic and CIA agent homes. But there's not one report from the actual embassy itself. But what about cleaners at these homes? What about neighbors? The Cubans interviewed the neighbors, they canvassed the areas, and they weren't finding people with the same symptoms or hearing unusual sounds and things like this. But those sounds, as I said earlier, for that initial cohort, the 8 that made the recordings, they were identified as cricket sounds. And those are sounds that the Cubans would have lived with. They would have been familiar with, where the Americans wouldn't have been.
You know, the Academy asserts that their reports are consensus reports, and it appears that this particular report is not a consensus report. In fact, I'm wondering if anyone can bring that to the attention of the right people at the Academy to redress that.
You know, I wasn't aware of that, but I will look into that. And I'm sure it's true. You're telling me that. I'll just look into that because, and that's key. But the thing is, it's really unfortunate, especially in the age of all kinds of misinformation out there. Like when you hear the word science, the National Academy of Sciences, you would think that would hold weight in the public perception, and it does, just like JAMA does. But people, and then they hear it in a news report, and that's it, right? I mean, it's just a short report, a soundbite, and it's over. And you really, this is a complex issue, and it doesn't lend itself easily to sound bites. But look, thank you very much for that. And I've written that down, and I'll make a note of that.
Yeah, it's I've noticed that several times when I was looking at other reports that there is a statement there, but that of course is a consensus. I mean, they could claim it's a consensus only within the panel. And most cases, very few Academy members are on those panels. You might have 2, 3 tops out of 12. And so, yeah, I hope you will follow up on that.
I will. And, you know, the other aspect of this case that's interesting is, I mean, they were interviewing people like Beatrice Golub at the University of San Diego. I would not describe her as a mainstream scientist. And she has some non-mainstream ideas about that it was microwave radiation and stuff like this. They should have interviewed more mainstream scientists. They should have interviewed Bob Ballo or myself or Sergio Della Sella at the University of Edinburgh, who have been, we went to the, well, I went with Sergio Della Sella to the Cuban conference in Havana. And I'm surprised they didn't interview these people. For example, when I was at the panel meeting in Cuba, Beatrice Golub gave a conference presentation. And she said, well, it couldn't be mass psychogenic illness because the patients weren't colluding together.
Yeah.
There was no evidence that they were trying to collude their testimonies. And I'm like, that's not mass psychogenic illness. And so then I asked her, I said, what do you think about mass psychogenic illness? And she said, well, I don't believe that mass psychogenic illness exists. And then I said, well, I have no further questions. But she is not a mainstream scientist. Michael Hoffer has been involved in serious scientific controversy in the past with things that he has done. And I would not describe him as a mainstream scientist either. And so what's the harm in interviewing Professor Ballo or myself? I just don't get it unless you're trying to reach a particular conclusion.
I have no idea how they actually choose the panels. So I can't offer any insight there.
Okay.
Yep.
Tish had a question. What is the general opinion of the Foreign Service folks, especially those that thought they had Havana syndrome?
Well, it varies. You know, the first person to contact me who was at the American Embassy when this happened was furious. Not with me, but with Michael Hoffer, because Michael Hoffer had come out with a statement saying something like, well, a lot of these patients didn't know anything about the other patients had symptoms. And they were saying, that's not true. I was there and it spread like wildfire because we had families and we felt we had an obligation, even though we're asked to keep it quiet, that everybody knew. They said it was not a secret at all. And it spread through the Canadian embassy as well. And so that's one aspect of it. And no, what was the other aspect of the question?
So what was the opinion of the folks that thought they had Havana syndrome? The people.
Well, it does vary. Some of these people have pushed back hard, saying, you know, we're not crazy, as I mentioned before, but I'm not calling them crazy. I'm just saying they're suffering from a collective stress syndrome, or outside of Cuba in particular, I think the majority of people don't have mass psychogenic illness. They're simply redefining an array of mostly ambiguous symptoms under a new heading, Havana syndrome. Some have been very sympathetic, contacting me and Professor Bob Ballo. Others, no. Others are like furious that we're saying they have mass hysteria. I'm saying that, you know, I'm not calling them crazy. I'm not saying they're mentally disturbed. I'm not saying they're psychologically disturbed. But I am saying that there's two major things that are going on here. You've got some that are suffering from mass psychogenic illness, but the vast majority simply redefining an array of symptoms that they would have had anyway. And they're just conveniently placing them under this new label. You know, ever since I was a kid growing up in upstate New York on Lake Champlain, I'd sit there 1 or 2 times a year on the farm, and all of a sudden, it's quite quiet, and my hearing would seem to just drop out. And I'd hear this high-pitched sound, and it's like a whining sound. It would go for a few seconds, and then it would disappear. And it's like, wow, what was that? Then it would go away, and I'd forget about it until it happened again. And when I was writing the book with neurologist Bob Ballo, I mentioned that to Bob, and he goes, that's transient tinnitus. Happens all the time. It's very common. And since then, I've asked my students, you know, raise their hands, how many people have had that happen? And a lot of people, like 70, 80%, will say, oh, it happens at least once or twice a year. Several say it happens several times a month. And so there's all kinds of phenomena out there that deal with the vestibular system, with balance, with spatial awareness. What really frustrates and angers me is when a supposedly respected news outlet like CBS 60 Minutes comes on earlier this year and they are peddling the microwave hypothesis, and that there have been attacks at the White House. And there was one poor woman who was at the White House working there. She was walking down some stairs and got dizzy, and they're suggesting that this and had spatial difficulty, spatial awareness issues, suggesting it was a microwave attack. And they interviewed one of the diplomats who was in China in 2017, 2018, and they came back because they thought they had been attacked in China over several months. And they were in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania at a hotel, and they were being medically investigated, him and his family. And one night, the guy got up in the middle of the night and he saw one of his children thrashing in the bed, and he went to pick them up. And as he did, he heard this strange whooshing sound like water running. Then he went to pick up his other child, and the same thing happened. And they insinuated that that might have been a microwave attack from some foreign agent. When, if you talk to a neurologist or hearing specialist, any neurologist or hearing specialist would tell you that that's a common symptom of tinnitus. In fact, there's a neurologist who's written an article called, "Is that tinnitus or is the water running?" And so I've got no problem with 60 Minutes giving an episode on this and giving that side of the story, but give the other side. Because that's such a common symptom. And interview some skeptics. And they did not interview any skeptics.
Dang. So I really appreciate your trying to describe the symptom as just a collection of conditions that are aggregated under this term, Havana Syndrome. Oh,
yeah, and that's what the main CIA, the interim report that came out in January, has said.
yeah.
That of the over 1,000 reports we have now, that
So
the vast majority are explainable. And then people have latched onto this thing about, wow, there's a small number of cases that are not explainable. But that reminds me of the UFO stuff and the UFO government investigations, right? Like they'll explain hundreds, if not thousands of cases, right? And then they'll say, well, there's just simply insufficient data with which to make an accurate assessment.
Yeah.
So they leave it as unexplained. But when you say, oh, they're unexplained, then in the press, they have a field day. Oh, the CIA can't explain several of these so-called attacks, right? And it gets hyped in the media, this whole unexplained thing. There are Bigfoot reports that are unexplained. I don't necessarily think Bigfoot is out there. I don't necessarily think people are being abducted by space aliens, which has nothing to do with the fact that there may be extraterrestrial life in the universe. That's a different story. But there's a lot of things that are unexplained. It doesn't mean that it's a foreign power engaging in these attacks. And the other thing is the US government from I think it was 1978 to the early 90s did engage in things like remote viewing with soldiers, but it didn't work. And eventually they pulled the plug right on that. And so you've got the US government has engaged in research on sonic and microwave weapons. I'm sure the Chinese have, and the Russians probably as well. But it doesn't mean it works, because there's something called the laws of physics.
Yep. So I think the people that call it mass psychogenic illness, however well intended they may be, I think they're that just triggers some of the people who claim to have these symptoms, and they say, I am not psychogenic or what have you. So
That's right.
I think the new terminology the CIA came up with is just the right way to go, to sort of just frame it as you're not well, just having that name, mass psychogenic illness, has some baggage to it.
people say to me, they say, you don't know what you're talking about. You're an idiot. Concussion-like symptoms, white matter tract changes, hearing loss, brain damage. That's not mass hysteria, but that's not what happened. If you look at the 2018 Journal of the American Medical Association study, the first one to be done, of the patients, they found before the study was released that many of the patients had these mysterious white matter tract changes in their brains. That was in the media for months and months and months. When the actual study came out, 3 people had white matter tract changes. 2 were mild, 1 was moderate. If you randomly pick 21 people off the street today, you'll have a similar breakdown, because white matter tract changes are common in everything from depression to all kinds of things, migraine headaches, and even dementia, right? And then people say, but what about the concussion-like symptoms? How can you explain that? The concussion-like symptoms, if you look closely at the scans, it's not clear. It's very ambiguous. There's no evidence, clear evidence of brain damage. And then people say, but how can you explain the hearing loss? Well, that's in reference to the so-called University of Miami study of December of 2018. Even before that study came out, information was leaked to the press that about a third of the patients had hearing loss. But when the actual study came out, they found only 2 people had hearing loss, both of whom had pre-existing hearing loss before they went to Cuba. So how did that happen? When they were interviewing the patients, they said, well, we think we have hearing loss, about a third. But when they actually did the basic hearing test, the only 2 that had hearing loss were the 2 that had pre-existing hearing loss before they went there. So you get all these things out there. That whole thing about white matter tract changes and hearing loss, that was in the media and reported for month after month after month in 2017 and then again in 2018. And then the study comes out and it says it's not true. Okay, well, that study comes out and it's only on there for a few days. All these other claims have been reported on for month after month after month. And there's many more articles on that making these claims than the actual study when it did come out, which is less sensational, isn't it? It's very sensational to think there were white matter tract changes and all these things going on.
Yeah. Alrighty.
You haven't mentioned what the Cuban government came up with as an explanation. I suspect it's pretty similar to what the CIA came up with.
That's right. And, you know, that's really interesting because the Cubans, they're kind of like the Rodney Dangerfield of this whole saga because they don't get any respect. It's like it's the Cubans, you can't trust them. And the US government there, they weren't sharing their information with them or their data. But the Cubans, to show you how convinced the Cubans were, I mean, first of all, there's nothing in it for the Cubans to have bad relations here. The Cubans actually invited the FBI over to Cuba 3 times, and they came over and investigated themselves. And that FBI study still hasn't been officially released. Just the conclusions were released. But Mitchell Valdez Sosa, who is the head of the Cuban Center for Neuroscience, they've gone around the homes there and they've interviewed people to see if there's similar symptoms, and they haven't found them. They are adamant that it's not the Cuban government that's involved here. And they've been very transparent, I have to say. I mean, to let the FBI come over there and give them basically free rein 3 different times. And I think that may be one of the reasons why the FBI concluded the way it did. I mean, they were able to go over there and look at things. But again, that FBI report still hasn't been released. Why hasn't that report been released, even in redacted form? I mean, I don't understand why. And also the documents in this case. I made a Freedom of Information Act request, I think, 5 years ago. And I still haven't, no one's received any of the FOIA documents yet. I just think that we have a case here where the CIA today, the main CIA and the FBI, have figured this thing out, and the government and people in the government are doing their best to muddle the waters and muddy the waters, because it's embarrassing to think that the mating calls of crickets and cicadas were mistaken for a sonic and then later microwave attack. And then you had the group from Canada, you don't hear much about them anymore, who claimed it was pesticides because they were spraying for the Zika virus around this time. But there's no pesticide in the world that only affects American and Canadian embassy staff and their families. So yeah, that one's kind of fallen by the wayside now.
Wow. So we had a question from Randy. Have you ever looked into the Taos hum?
Yeah, we go through the Taos hum, and I was going to make that point because people are hearing strange humming sounds for Havana syndrome, right? And that's part of the syndrome. And some of these people, Bob Ballo, the neurologist, noted this. We have a whole chapter on the hum, right? And Bob Ballo noted that some of these reports of people in Havana, some of the diplomats hearing these strange sounds and having symptoms, parallel the Taos hum and the Kokomo hum and a couple other hums, the Bristol hum, and there's a lot of them, but I mean the big ones are the Taos one, the Kokomo one, and very similar in terms of the way they were hearing the sound, like they'd move rooms and it would seem to die down, or the way they were describing it. Bob pointed out that their descriptions of Havana syndrome were very similar to some of these hum reports, and the way people were moving and the way the sound was changing. And of course, I mean, there's all kinds of, you've got possibility of tinnitus, you've got all kinds of, equipment running and all sorts of explanations for the hum that are all mundane, right? I mean, there's been several studies done on these hums, and we could hypothesize that they're flying saucers landing, and it's their equipment that's jamming with our TV signals or something, making these humming sounds, right? I mean, there's all kinds of things you can speculate with. But again, when you hear the sound of hoofbeats in the night, first think horses, not zebras.
Yeah.
And certainly not unicorn.
That's right.
So we had a Professor Mullins, Joe Mullins, talked to NMSR a couple decades ago, and he was an engineer that looked into the Taos hum pretty carefully, and he took a lot of instrumentation up there and made acoustic measurements, electromagnetic measurements, and he basically was not able to verify physically that there was an unusual hum at all. But he also concluded that the people who experienced it were absolutely sincere, and they really were experiencing something, and slightly unusual for sure.
I think with Havana syndrome, I think what we've got here, people say, oh, it's new and it's never happened before. I think we've got a classic technology scare. So if you go back in the past, when in the 1870s and 80s, you had telephone sickness. People were hearing crackling sounds on the telephone. And because this was, people hadn't heard telephone sounds before over a wire like this, it was seen as making them sick. And when AM radio first came out, people were claiming that it was making them sick, and it was also affecting the weather. When ice cubes first came out, because they were created from so-called artificial technology, artificial cold, people were claiming ice cubes were making them sick. Wi-Fi, computer display terminals causing birth defects, right? The Wi-Fi group today, mobile phones, all these things. I I think it's classic technology scare, repetition strain in the 80s and Australia, which got the nickname kangaroo paw because it was so prominent there, but not where they had the same keyboards in other countries, right? Which goes back to telegraphist cramp in the early part of the 1900s. So I think it's not necessarily something that's new, but it's a fear of new technology and what it can do to us. And what's the new technology? Well, some foreign government has developed this new secret weapon, and they're targeting Americans. Some of the cases were quite incredulous. Like you had, I think, in one of the embassies, I think it was in Colombia, one of the diplomats, the American embassy, at their home at night, claimed to have been attacked, him and his family. Okay, so you're telling me that the Russians, perhaps, or the Chinese, working in conjunction with the Cubans, right? Because they have low level of technology in Cuba, they've developed this new sonic or microwave weapon that's been in the pipeline for decades. They put all this research into it, and they finally developed it. And what are they doing? They're flying it over to Colombia, and they're pointing at this poor diplomat's home at night, and they're making him and his family sick, or they're making some American diplomat sick. If Vladimir Putin has this technology, why are they using conventional weapons and losing the war in Ukraine? And it just doesn't make any sense. I mean, the most plausible explanation is the one that I've outlined.
Yeah. Here in New Mexico, in our state capital, Santa Fe, we have one of the world leaders of Wi-Fi sensitivity, and they have sued the city of Santa Fe several times for not taking down Wi-Fi towers or whatnot. And they claim to be physically affected, and so far I think they've lost. But
well, I know you've got a windmill in the background there, the wind turbine. Wind farm syndrome.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
That and the interesting thing there is they've done studies here at the University of Auckland there, Keith Petrie and his group, where they have looked at wind turbines, and there's a lot of hubbub around it, and people living in the area have all these symptoms. And then there's other places overseas, basically it's the same device. People aren't aware of it, and nobody's reporting symptoms, But wind turbine symptoms, I think, I've seen over 200 in one of the books that was written, over 200 symptoms attributed to it, from cancer to, you name it, that's been attributed to wind turbine symptom.
So that's the craziest part of some of these offices that announced, oh, everybody is feeling these symptoms. Watch out for, this kind of sickness or that kind of sickness. When you issue a warning like that, people are going to experience symptoms. Don't they know that psychologically?
The other aspect there is potential for compensation, right? Just like Havana Syndrome. They're giving out all this money to people who, look, I said recently, I said, you know what? Give them the compensation. For the fact that, the government has botched this investigation, and they are genuinely stressed over what's been going. But there was a lot of compensation paid in the 80s in Australia for repetition strain, right? And that has just kind of like melted away. Whatever happened to repetition strain? There used to be, because I went to school there in the 80s, there used to be signs in the computer centers. Make sure every half hour you do exercises. And one was you put your fingers out like this and you stretch your fingers hard as you can sideways. And then you go like this, then you go back like this. And but we don't do that anymore. And it's just quite interesting how it's kind of, we go through these fashions and fads.
Yeah.
But carpal tunnel syndrome is real. I mean, you know, it makes it harder to work on this.
Yeah, exactly. And but if you've got like people do get carpal tunnel syndrome, but people were having all kinds of aches and pains in their fingers, right, in their hands, far, far, far greater than carpal tunnel syndrome, and it's not showing up, right? And in other countries where they have the same keyboard, same company keyboards and things like that, made by the same company, it's not happening, right? Which is very similar to telegraphist cramp. And it kind of went away. I mean, it certainly faded when they stopped giving compensation for it.
I've got a question about the compensation. Is there, we see a lot of ads late at night for class action suits for people that you know, had talcum powder in their baby powder or what have you, which, you know, doesn't actually affect people, according to our last speaker. So what has there been the class action suit saying, have you been affected by Havana syndrome? Call us now.
There was an ad that's been running in upstate New York asking people to call in. I've called the number and they don't answer. But yeah, there are some ads playing now in upstate New York for this, and they played over the last year. There is a guy, his last name begins with the letter Z, who is an attorney for some of these Havana syndrome victims. And he's pushing for Mark Zaid, I think his name is, and pushing for compensation. And of course, the government has this compensation now. They've passed this law, and they're giving compensation for Havana syndrome. So that's going. And my observation there is, you know, you have Congress can't even agree to ban automatic weapons, yet they can give out hundreds of thousands of dollars for a dubious condition, Havana syndrome.
Meh. All righty. Well, that's certainly been a fascinating discussion. Anybody have comments or questions they haven't got to yet? I think we got all the things in the chat.
I see a picture of John Durr there. Is that the one that did Earthlights?
Yes.
Is that yeah, I'm a big fan of yours. I think you've done some great work. So thank you.
Hi, Robert. Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, just a couple months ago, we had a session on that with a couple other people. So that's on the YouTube.
I did that book with John Howard, a psychologist at the University of Notre Dame, which looked at UFO sighting waves, and then also some close encounter reports and stuff like that. Yeah. But the stuff that John Durr has done is really interesting, and the stuff with Michael Persinger, who unfortunately has passed away. I mean, he did some really interesting stuff as well up there. Fascinating stuff. The other thing is, I'm not sure if you're aware of it. I'll just mention it. I don't know if you've seen my encyclopedia Outbreak, but that one, that took 10 years to write with British historian Hilary Evans, and we look at, you know, UFOs, but a lot of social panics, mass psychogenic illness, moral panics, collective delusions, cults, stuff like that. But yeah, I'll get that plug in there as well while I'm here.
Fascinating. So the War of the Worlds thing that Orson Welles narrated, that was kind of overhyped, right? It did not have people committing suicide in upstate New York or what have you.
Look, that's right. I did a book called Panic. Where is it? Do I have the book here? I don't, but called Panic Attacks, Media Manipulation and Mass Delusion. I looked at a whole bunch of different War of the Worlds scares, radio scares. That was hyped in terms of people actually panicking and trying to flee. Some did. There are clear reports from the day. I'd say maybe a few hundred, probably not more than 1,000 or more. But I think in concrete Washington, there was a power outage at the same time, shortly after the broadcast aired, and it looked like the Martians were invading and the power went out. There was evidence there of some families actually getting people together and going to the hills. Other than that, no. There was a small, there was a college, and I think South Carolina maybe, where a group of, it was reported a group of female students had fainted. But no, it was certainly, it's been exaggerated. But people were concerned. I mean, to the point of not fleeing, but there's no doubt that the phone lines were flooded. We know that from the records. And there's a police blotter where they were saying, I received 50 or 100 phone calls within half an hour or something, people claiming there was a radio broadcast. We have the actual police blotter. So there was some concern. Particularly, the concern was centered around downstate New York, New York City, Long Island, and upstate New Jersey, because that is where the Martian invasion was supposedly taking place, and in the vicinity of Grover's Mill, New Jersey, which was supposedly the epicenter of the attack.
Yeah.
I have one last question. On the mass hysteria front, have you any particular insights into the mass hysteria we have amongst the so-called conservative people here in the United States and the stolen election?
I would see that, yeah, I'd see that as not so much mass hysteria, mass psychogenic illness, as more of a social panic. And I think that, too many people these days have stopped searching for information. And instead, they're searching for confirmation and affirmation of pre-existing beliefs online with social media. And I think outlets like Fox News aren't doing us any favors, because they're not balanced. They're not giving the other side. And Facebook, I think there needs to be more control there and more scrutiny of what's going on. And it's concerning. I mean, look at that story from TikTok in the last day with those poor people, and I think it's Syria, and asking for money. They're in refugee camps, and TikTok was taking 70%, and somebody else was taking a cut. And there needs to be more accountability there. You just can't say anything you like, and there needs to be accountability in terms of who said what and how can you trace it back. All this anonymity online, it's a concern, and it's not been fixed. And I don't know what the solution is, but they need to do something.
And the echo chambers the internet has enabled, basically echo chambers where people can be indoctrinated into the belief systems without external facts coming into play.
The algorithms and stuff like that.
Oh yeah.
Maybe the answer is regulation. I guess how you do that, but it's not working at the present time, and something needs to be done. I mean, it's just pitting neighbor against neighbor, and yeah, it's not good.
Yeah, I agree. Well, that was a wonderful presentation and several comments to that effect. So good luck with your future books. I'll have to check out that chapter on the Tao's Home. Sounds fascinating.
Yeah, look, thank you so much for inviting me. And I've always, over the last several years, felt bad about, I think it was the first time I ever did an interview on, I didn't know if Zoom was going at the time, but
That was way
it didn't
pre-Zoom,
work out.
yeah.
And then I think Ben Radford had to jump in and finish. It was on the Lake Champlain Monster or something, I think.
Yeah, we're trying to make that international connection and it just didn't work. And
yeah,
we thought it
well,
could, and it wasn't all
I'm
on your
more
end either.
used to Zoom and Skype and WebEx and all these other ones now. So it's all good. Look, it's my pleasure. I, from time to time, read some of the stuff that has been done with the New Mexico group, and yeah, keep fighting the good fight.
All righty. Well, thanks so much, and take care, everybody, and we'll have something else fun to talk about next month. All righty.